Saif, you've tackled so many different compelling ideas in this book. Is there a central idea that pulls it all together?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Bob. It's a pleasure to be discussing this with you. I'm glad you wanted to have this book early on so that we could discuss it, and I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. So I'll say, the central idea of the book is just what would have happened if money kept advancing as a technology, just like pretty much everything else advanced as a technology in the 20th century. And in my opinion, if you've read the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard and Principles of Economics, my third book, you'd see that I'd probably argue that in the 20th century, money has not really evolved well as a technology. It has actually regressed. And it became more inflationary, and so it became much worse at holding on to value. And that compromises one of the main reasons for the existence of money and the essential property on which money's value rests. And so that, in my previous books, I argue, has been massively destructive to human civilization. It has been massively conducive to war and to wasteful government spending and to the essentially systematic industrialized pillaging of people's savings over time. And we witness now with Bitcoin the emergence of an alternative where people are able to build a monetary society, a monetary system, and around it essentially a society where inflation has been effectively conquered and people get to keep the fruits of their labor. So the existence of Bitcoin has sparked all of these questions in my mind and made them much more vivid, particularly because you see how people individually, particularly in the Bitcoin world, change as they get into Bitcoin and how Bitcoin changes people. So I'd had this in my mind for quite a while. What would the 20th century have looked like if we did not have fiat money, if instead we stayed on the gold standard, but the gold standard became more advanced, more free in the sense of being competitive as an industry so that people can enter and exit the industry. And so ultimately, the hinge that I used in history breaks society's monetary evolution around the year of 1915, exactly in September 1915, during World War I, where I hypothesized about what would happen had these governments run out of money and their currencies collapsed and the war ended and fiat money died. And so the way that I bring that about is to indulge in a thought experiment ultimately related to the industrial advancement of monetary clearance technology in the early 20th century through aviation, which then exposes the essential Ponzi scheme that these central banks had ran in order to fight the First World War. And so what ends up happening in that world where we have more competitive market for money and banking, people don't keep their money in their central banks, and so the central bank inflation shows up a lot quicker. So there's a quote, while I was doing the research here, there's a quote where Keynes was describing the exact kind of Ponzi that the Bank of England and the British government had engaged in order to facilitate British entry into the war. And essentially it was a massive lie. It's a very central idea, and it's something that was only discovered in 2017, and it upends our understanding of World War I, and I think people need to reckon with the implication of this thing, because if people back then knew what happened, it would have very severe ramifications. But we only discovered this 102 years later, when the Financial Times issued a correction of its article. We'll discuss this in more detail. But effectively, at that point, there was a massive swindle by the Bank of England and the British government in order to get Britain into war. And John Maynard Keynes was in on this scheme, and in it he said the capacity of the bank, meaning the Bank of England, to lend safely to the government is practically limited by the extra amount which, in time of war, bankers and the bank's other customers are prepared to keep idle against emergencies. So the longer people keep their money at the bank, the more the bank can continue to lend to the government to fight this war. That's what's ultimately resting upon, because they increased the money supply enormously because fundamentally nobody bought the bonds, or very few people bought the bonds to fight that war. So the entire premise for entering the war financially was built on lies. And of course, the justifications for the war itself were also built on lies. So I dig into that, and I imagine, what if people had just simply had the alternative available to them so that they could take their money out of the banks and central banks and instead own it themselves and use it to have their wealth outside of this banking system, therefore free to move around, and therefore not financing the war. So what's going to happen to the war? Well, the war ends, and we witness an outbreak of peace and sound money, and then the book unfolds.
And the first third of the book, maybe it's not a third, but it was a quarter maybe, is an explanation of what was going on leading into World War I. And while I have heard the story many times, you emphasize towards the end of the recount of the historical facts how concentrated the gold became, and therefore came under the control of the government to leverage it. And the lie that happened in England, which it's probably worth going through some of the details of that, really could not have been as big, and they wouldn't have been able to raise as much money, essentially. Even though they were able to get some money out, if the public had known that they didn't have the gold backing, it would have been even more reluctant to lend.
For sure, absolutely. This is the the history in the Anglo-speaking countries has been covered up a little bit and airbrushed in order to make it look a lot more defensible than what it was. But ultimately, the entry into the war came through massive financial fraud, without which they could not have mobilized the army to the extent that they did. And it's quite remarkable reading about it, because they auctioned the bonds, and the bonds were paying a higher interest rate than the regular government bonds, and they expected people to be buying them and to lap them up. But a very small number of people bought. Only a few dozen thousand, I think, people bought. The numbers are in the book. And a small percentage of all of the stock and bond traders in the country actually bought the bond issue, because it was an unpopular war and people didn't see the reason for it, and they didn't quite understand why they were fighting their fellow Europeans.
Yeah, it was surprising to me that you pointed out that the Germans and the English were actually quite friendly as both citizens and even governments, and that they had a record high amount of economic activity between them at the time.
Yes, it's true. In fact, the King of Germany was the grandson of Queen Victoria. So he was the cousin of the first King of Britain. Queen Victoria, she died in his arms. And at a certain point, he was the sixth in line for the throne of Britain. He could have been the King of Britain and the Kaiser of Germany. So, they were intermarried, and of course there was a lot of business between them. And what's really astonishing about the lead-up is that on the day on which Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, on that very same day, 5 British dreadnoughts had traveled to be in Germany. 5 massive military ships went to Germany to celebrate with the German Navy on something called the Kiel Regatta Week, where boats of the German Navy would gather, and the British came and they celebrated and they partied together, and they had friendly boxing matches. And then the next morning, on that next day, the Crown Prince of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. And then the whole thing kicked off, and within 5 weeks, British and German soldiers were at war with each other.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin. Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesafehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by the Daylight Computer. I love to work early in the morning and late at night, or in the sun outdoors, but regular computer screens are terrible at these times, and they strain your eyes. For years, I've wanted a paper-like electronic screen on a simple computer I could use to write. I tried several models, but none were very good. Now, finally, Daylight have delivered a fantastic full-function tablet with a paper-like screen that's easy on your eyes and great for outdoor use. I've been using the Daylight computer to write my next book, and it is absolutely fantastic, and it has led me to invest in this company myself. Check out my interview with Anjan Kata in episode 249.
The other thing that struck me about the history was how all of the governments had these geopolitical ambitions that had very little to do with public support in their countries, and that it was all about a strategic advantage over the long run. And you make a good point that without the ability to fund it, they would have had to answer to their citizens to raise the funds, which would have been remarkably difficult.
Exactly. And so I really think, if you look at the way that politics is playing out at that point, a big part of the financing or the impetus behind empire was the getting people onto the Bank of England monetary system so they could essentially deposit their gold in the Bank of England, and then the Bank of England could issue increasing quantities of credit against it. Because by the outbreak of World War I, the Bank of England only had about 31% gold backing behind its gold liabilities. I have the exact statistic and source in the book. So already they had, extended so much credit based on the reputation of the pound and the reputation of the gold standard. But the British government effectively took that for granted, that they could just resort to that during World War I, and that's essentially what they did. They launched the bond auction, as we were saying earlier, but people didn't buy it. And so I think about a third of the bonds were sold, if I recall correctly. And then a big chunk of that was sold to the banks and the Bank of England officially. So the government so the Bank of England and the banks used their customers' deposits in order to buy some of these bonds. But even that was not enough. And so therefore, the Bank of England gets 2 of its employees to buy 2/3 of the World War I bond issuance under their own names, with a credit line extended to them privately from the Bank of England. And they use that credit line from the Bank of England to buy the bonds which send Britain to World War I. And that gets covered up until 2017. It's absolutely amazing. It's 103 years, essentially, since until this was basically uncovered by a bunch of people working in the Bank of England who dug down into the attics and then found the exclusive report that was prepared for the bank to explain what had happened. And then, of course, in the real world, this gets even more dark and complicated because they start collecting all the gold from Britain and shipping it to the U.S. in order to finance the credit that they were undertaking. But in this alternative history, the people keep their gold and the people use their own gold, and the government runs out of other people's money a lot quicker, and that's why the pound collapses around
Which gets
1915.
Yeah, which really cuts at the Keynes quote that you made, where if you don't keep your money in the bank in the form of gold, then the banks don't control that gold, and they don't send it up to the central banks. And you point out in the formation of the U.S. Central Bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve, in 1913, that was actually late, that most of the European countries had already established central banks that were controlling their banking systems and collecting the gold, or at least having some influence over where that gold resided and what was to happen with the gold. Is that right?
Yeah, the U.S. was an outlier from the industrial countries in that it was the last to have a gold-backed central bank. It was effectively on the gold standard, but there was no central bank up until 1913. Christmas Eve in 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and then in 1914 the bank began operation. And it wasn't the first bank, it was actually the fourth incarnation of the Federal Reserve, or of a central U.S. bank. But it was a pretty precarious thing, and during World War I, it immediately got into the habit of lending for European powers that were at war. And therefore, it had likely an incentive to bring the world into war. But in my book, the war ends in 1915, so the U.S. doesn't even enter the war. And so I thought, having the hinge happen in World War I would be good because it would teach everybody the real face of Fiat. Everybody would get a good, brutal touch of the stove before moving on into, not wanting to touch the stove again.
The power of the book is in the stark contrast between the two worlds. It's an idea. It's a thought that I've had a lot as well. I've always wondered what would the world look like, because we really, I guess, we began in 1915. In 1971, the real separation occurred, where if you look at all the charts, you can see the kind of more exponential rise in all of the problems that you would expect to unfold. Do you want to talk about the mechanism that you're using? Do you want to talk about BTC?
Yeah, so, the book is called The Gold Standard, but let's face it, it's really a Bitcoin book. I think a lot of gold people may be surprised by that. It is a book about the gold standard, but the way that the gold standard succeeds in becoming money during the 20th century is essentially through peer-to-peer Bitcoin technology. And I made that, abundantly and almost maybe to too much of an extent, abundantly clear in the book, in that the way that the world changes is because in the early 20th century, the aviation industry witnesses an increase in competitiveness and an increase in the speed of invention and technological innovation in the industry, which comes about from essentially the Wright brothers putting aside their lawsuits against all the aviation pioneers in the U.S. and Europe, because that's what essentially they were doing.
That was news to me, and it's probably worth just mentioning here. Everybody knows the Wright brothers, and they never became famous for any company or any, all of the other, Ford, who invented the scale production of automobiles, is well known. He still has a company, but the Wright brothers did not. And you pointed out there's a good reason for that.
Yes, they spent their lives trying to sue everyone. They had a very clear idea about what airplanes were for and how airplanes should work, and they just thought airplane is our thing. We did it, we made it, we were the ones who would fly. I mean, I'm exaggerating here to get the point across, but essentially the majority of aviation pioneers in the late 1990s, 1908, 9, 10, 11, the majority of these people were just stuck in courtroom battles with one another, or primarily with the Wright brothers, who were out there suing a lot of people. Because, to be fair to them, the Wright brothers did really invent flight. They were the first to actually make flight, and they invented the mechanism that made it possible. And everybody had to build on that mechanism, more or less. It's still the control mechanism that we have in airplanes to this day. But after they did it, their focus went away from trying to build their own businesses and building airplanes into trying to sue others. They would
Defend their intellectual property, yeah.
Yeah, they would even sue people who were flying for competitions because they had copied their design, not even people who were making and selling airplanes, just flying in competitions. So in my book, I have a kind of very liberal approach on the issue of intellectual property. I don't think it's something that the state should be interfering in. I think, there would be some forms of intellectual property that emerge in a market where people can prove that they own things, and people who want them to benefit from it can, of course, reward them. And I think it's likely a more fruitful avenue for us as a species if we just became much more open about our ideas, because the cost of transmitting ideas is very cheap, and we should not look at that as being a curse, but rather a blessing. It's a very good thing. Which is why I usually encourage people to pirate my books, and I don't care.
But even believing that, be that as it may, it didn't matter in the book because you point out that somebody comes to them and says, I got an idea, let's go into a partnership and we can make lots of money, and they do that.
Exactly. So it couldn't have just been the Wright brothers on their own, because we needed Europe to be in on this. So I looked into the history of European aviation pioneers, and one character stuck out to me as the Satoshi Nakamoto, essentially, of the 20th century. And this man...
Almost 19th century.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Missed it by 10 years.
Yeah, and this guy, he's in the real world, he was the one who invented the headlight. And also, he was the first to fly across the English Channel. So he flew from France to England, and he was the first to do that. And he set up one of the early aviation companies, and he had one of the first few commercial production of aircraft factories in Europe. He had it in France. And so he also had a lot of money. He was into flight because he loved it. He had a lot of money from the headlights business. And in my book, I just turn him into Satoshi Nakamoto, where he starts becoming suspicious of banks and central banks, and he wants his gold. And he decides, he arrives at this, as I should say, he arrives at it as kind of motivated reasoning. He's looking to find a commercial application for flight. He looks at Ford and what Ford's doing with the car, and he says, we need to figure out a way to get people to want to buy airplanes. But airplanes are too expensive to move people around at that point, and they're also too expensive to move goods around. The one good that might be economical to move around is the one that has the most value per unit of weight, which is gold. It's money. It's really the one thing that might be economical, because it's you're not going to make you're not going to justify taking an airplane for tomatoes at that stage, or for other kinds of good that are a lot more expensive per unit of value, per dollar, let's say, or per ounce of gold. So, or a lot heavier, I should say, per unit of value. So because of that, he decides the best way to move forward is to set up a gold clearance business, and will allow people to sidestep banks. It's essentially Bitcoin with analog technology. That's essentially how the idea and the motivation came. I mean, I've always been fascinated by the history of aviation. I've always studied it and been curious about it. And I wanted to come up with a Bitcoin tool for this story to work. And it seemed to me like this would be the best way. At some point, did consider some kind of massive leap in computing technology that allows people to build a Bitcoin on telegrams and telegraphs, but it seemed way too much of a stretch of the imagination. We still needed at least another 8-9 decades before we could make Bitcoin. So aviation is what it is. So this guy, his name is Louis Blériot. He's French. He contacts the Wright brothers and tells them, let's
You didn't
stop
even have to
fighting.
change his last name to begin with a B, did you?
Yeah, no, I picked him before I had even considered that. And then at some point, I realized he has a B in his name. I thought I have to make use of that because it fits so perfectly. So Blériot Transport Corporation is his brand. And so these jets all have BTC emblazoned upon them. And they fly all across Europe and the US and Canada, South America and Africa and Asia, all over the world, sending gold from one place to the other.
Well, you
And,
jumped to jets, but it's probably worth just saying that still with the old airplane, they're flying, and it's so popular that companies are sending gold to each other that there becomes a whole network outside of the banking system.
Exactly. It grows.
And then
people are
and then the
skeptical of anything.
aviation innovation starts accelerating.
Exactly. So because of this, aviation picks up. And because of this, banking becomes a lot more decentralized. And so all these central banks are in for a rude surprise starting with World War I. They did not expect that they were going to be in this kind of war that's going to require so much resources. And they did not expect that it would be such a problem, the fact that other people have this gold clearance service. But it was a big problem because it meant people didn't have to go through them. So they could use services that didn't send their gold to the central bank and just resort to clearing it directly amongst financial institutions that are independent of the central bank or directly among individuals or companies and so on. And so we rugged them. We rugged the central banks in 1915 and all their currencies collapsed. And if you look at it, the extent of inflation that took place in all of these countries around that time was truly catastrophic. All of these countries just destroyed their currencies, destroyed their economies, and they continued to pay the price for that many years later. Whether it was Germany, Russia, France, England, they all printed a lot of money, and you can see some of the details in the book. I get into it. So it could well have gone badly. I think it's entirely feasible and entirely plausible. And I use this quote from Keynes to illustrate that point, because at that point, he was in on it. He understood what they did. He called it a masterly manipulation. And he just said, it all depends on how much people are able to keep in the war. That's what
Leave their money in the banks, yeah.
Yeah, that's what we're counting on to not get lynched. So, it could have gone either way. There's no.
Well, one of the things you point out is that pretty quickly banks run into trouble. Probably worth explaining a little bit more about that. Only because they start failing, and then that also cascades up through the central banking system. And they wind up not only having less money, but having to put out default fires.
Yeah. So ultimately, after their currencies collapse, these central banks collapse, but their currencies are reborn because people are just used to using these units at that point. The pound, the dollar, the franc. They'd been around all their lives. All the lives of everybody who was alive had used these, and they had a certain quantity defined in terms of gold. So these currencies can re-emerge on the free market, issued by private banks and backed by full gold backing. And with the absence of a central bank that can bail out those banks, there was no alternative to them to remain safe and to demonstrate credibility except to very, very meticulously show that they have enough gold backing them. Backing all of their bills. And so because of that, we get a century of very safe financial infrastructure because there are no safety nets. So everything has to be done very meticulously to ensure there are no failures. If there is any hint of suspicion of inflation at a bank, people will start withdrawing their currency from it. And if the bank doesn't have enough gold, it would eventually go bankrupt and it'll get liquidated. And so in that kind of world, you'd expect that these bankruptcies would be frequent and fast. And so, as soon as the bank begins to do silly shenanigans, it gets caught out. And so shareholders would maybe get something like 70, 80, 90% back from their assets. And
Can we take 2 seconds and just explain shenanigans for viewers? Right?
Yes,
What is a bank doing that's
yes.
going to get them recognized? Banknotes start trading at a discount. What is it that they would have done besides all the headlines that we've seen for the last century?
Yeah, I guess shenanigans is another word for fiat. It's essentially using financial resources to generate more financial resources. And that's the voodoo around which all of modern economics is built, and something that I have spent my humble career pointing out the consequences of. So essentially, in the modern world, banks have a safety net, which is the central bank, which is behind them, backing them up, out there to ready to make press releases to say to the world that we stand ready to lend and to guarantee and to take care of these people.
This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
So, that makes banks usually a little bit more liberal in their risk-taking profile. And essentially the entire thing is financed through the devaluation of the currency, because the central bank can't bail banks out except through creating new currency unit, which effectively devalues existing currency unit. So in the real world, around 1914, 15, 16, 17, governments had effectively defaulted on their liabilities and devalued their currency, and they were no longer capable of meeting their promise of redeeming their currency in physical gold. So they defaulted. Now, the healthy way to deal with that default is what I do in my novel, which is, all right, you defaulted, your assets get liquidated, and we pay off the creditors and we see what we can wring out of you. And, other people who are more competent will have your capital and will get on with life and hopefully learn the lesson, or else end up on the same scrap heap of financial liquidation. So, in the real world, we did not choose that path. The government's default has been dragging out for the past 11 years maybe even. 111 years they've been dragging on this default because they managed to externalize the costs of it onto their taxpayers, onto the depositors at the banks by devaluing the money that is in the banks. One way
Sovereign debt buyers on their backs too.
Buyers, exactly. They've set up so many different Ponzi's through the years. The paper that was backed by gold, which was devalued because they created more paper, but also the banknotes. The bank accounts where credit was extended and the currency of the bank accounts was devalued, and then government bonds, which also get wiped out and often defaulted and get devalued, and the currency is constantly getting devalued. So we've had an entire century of governments using their monopoly over financial clearance in order to enforce financial penalties on savers, in order to cover up their own default and kick the can further down the line. And in my book, I just pulled that plug in 1915, and we get to, instead of having to suffer through a century plus of this default bankruptcy proceeding, we pull the plug and have it all sorted out by the end of 1916, and then we get to live like human beings for the rest of the century.
Exactly, and there's a flush. There's there's equity losses by the banks that were involved. The central banks all get weakened and ultimately disappear. And what's interesting is if a bank in that era had been lending poorly, their banknotes would start trading down. That would signal to the market, the other depositors and other people accepting those notes, that something might be wrong. And then you point out that if there's nothing wrong, then the bank can use their gold and shore up those banknotes. And if there is something wrong, they can't. And pretty quickly it's exposed. And in those cases, when you would liquidate a bank, the equity would be wiped out, and the depositors would probably only lose a few percentage points, maybe 10%, 15%, and that would be it. And then the bank would shut down and you'd move on. You know, the other banks would have to understand that the equity owners of all those banks could be liquidated immediately if the banknotes start trading down. And you do a good job of explaining the incentives and how banks very quickly need to always prove that they've got the gold there to cover the deposits.
Yeah, I think, just simply as a technology, banking and money should have advanced in the 20th century to include such issues. If we had honest money, the priority on the market would be to illustrate this honesty. And there would be a significant premium attached to companies that are able to illustrate their honesty. So ones that run full audits that are transparent, where you can come and see the vaults, and independent auditors are sent and they issue reports, and then they keep track of the number of bills that they have. I think, in the free market with 20th century technology, we could have had each one of these banknote issuing company would have a number out of how many bills they have outstanding, and they would be serially numbered. So if anybody can bring up two that have the same number, or anyone can find one with a number that is higher than the highest number, then they're clearly cheating. And there will be exchange houses that collect and receive plenty of currency every day, so they would be likely to track the serial number to make sure that these things don't happen. So you could see how by the mid-20th century, we could have had an extremely convenient, safe, and reliable technology for money and banking had it not been a government monopoly. And this book was just, me for a year or a year and a half thinking this question through and trying to follow the thought experiment. All right, so then what happens? Okay, so then the banks collapse, and then they stop collapsing. Obviously, they're going to get their act together, and eventually people are going to figure it out. And, we figure out how to make buildings not fall. We figure out how to make water pipes run. There's no reason why we can't figure out how to make banks reliable.
And unfortunately, money was a monopoly. As you point out in this book, it became a monopoly where there was very little payoff for any kind of advancement.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately,
And an event.
the ability of governments to just undermine the inflation, to undermine the currency with inflation, meant that we had a massive technological regression in our money. Our money was now terrible at holding its value, and our money now was essentially defeating the entire purpose for money. If you think about why money is money, one of the central ideas in my first book, The Bitcoin Standard, is to explain how money emerges on the market and how gold became money throughout the centuries. And the key property is the supply growth rate. How much the supply grows every year is one of the most important properties you'll see among monetary assets. It's why gold was the most important money in the world. It's the one whose supply grows at the lowest rate reliably, only around 1.5% to 2% per year. So when we switched to fiat money in 1914 and 1915, because governments have a monopoly on banks and central banking because they have all the gold and you have to go through them, when we switch then, our money goes from increasing at 1.5% to 2% per year to increasing at an average of 14% over the past 60 years. So between 1960 and 2020, it was about 14% on average, roughly speaking, for the whole world, with the better currencies like the dollar, the euro, the Swiss franc increasing at around 7-8% per year, and the worst currencies, the sky's the limit, 50%, 100% per year, supply increase sometimes. So you see just this massive degradation in the quality of money because it's terrible at holding its value, and that is reflected on everything that is dealing with money. And that is true to society at large, but perhaps even more acutely true to the financial industry itself and to the monetary industry, if you want, itself. The term monetary industry is non-existent in our lexicon because the monetary industry is usually just the government and its cronies. But another world is possible. Another world is possible in which it is possible to have freely competitive money.
This looks like a great segue to one of the core fundamental ideas that run through many of your books and is a central idea in Austrian economics of time preference. If the currency that you earn is devaluing quickly, then you have an urgency to spend or invest or do something with the money besides hold it. Why don't we talk a little bit about time preference and why this becomes a core driving force between the difference of society today and society as it might have been in this counterfactual that you started in 1915.
Yeah, I mean, time preference is a very, very important topic in economics for me, when I was giving my own special courses. But usually in regular economics classes, they don't teach you time preference. And I think this is a huge damning indictment of modern economic teaching. So people value the present more. You always value the future less. And you can think of the process of civilization as being the process of accumulating capital caused by the lowering of time preference, which allows us to defer consumption in order to invest into the future or in order to defer the gratification from the present and have better and more gratification in the future. What helps us lower our time preference, this is maybe kind of the unique contribution that I add to the study of time preference in the Austrian tradition, is to explicitly draw the connection between the hardness of money and time preference, which, in my opinion, is the hardness of money is like a control knob for time preference. Because when your money is hard and you can have a high degree of certainty in the ability of the money to deliver value into the future and to maintain its value into the future. So I contend in my work that as we moved from gold, which increased at only around 1.5% to 2% per year, to fiat money, which increased at around 7 to 14% per year, depending on where you were born, and sometimes much more, you, as an individual, started witnessing an increase in your time preference caused by the increasing uncertainty around your ability to save for the future. With every currency collapse, with every devaluation, with every slow grinding inflation, with every slow increase in prices, with every bank collapse, with every bank government confiscating bank accounts, with all of these things happening throughout the century, people's ability to save for the future is compromised. So people's ability to think of the future is also compromised. In other words, people's valuation of the future declines, so people's time preference rises. And I think this explains so much that we see around us in the last century. We have so much wealth because we have so much capital, because we've accumulated it over centuries of increasingly low time preference. And you can see the declining time preference in the interest rates. You see how interest rates are declining as civilization is advancing and as we are becoming more and more prosperous. And then the beginning of the 20th century happens, World War I happens, we go on fiat money, and then interest rates shoot up, time preference shoots up, and inflation shoots up, and I don't think that these are a coincidence.
Well, and one of the manifestations of this is the time that in a time preference environment under fiat, you need to dedicate a higher amount of your time and energy to protecting the value that you've created. You work for several years, you build an amount of savings. That savings cannot be left in fiat because you know it will be declining. So you have to gain skills at investing this money. And that becomes an industry that doesn't need to exist.
Yes, I think if money worked, then people would be primarily saving their wealth. And that would be a good thing. They would have significant amounts of savings, I think, with increasing productivity in the 20th century. And if people had the ability to save in a liquid money, if bank accounts were backed by gold throughout the century, and you could just save in your bank account, or you could just hold on to physical gold and witness it relatively appreciate every year, then I think with the technology we had in the 20th century, living standard would have increased so much, and people's savings would have also increased so much. And it is entirely feasible to imagine that we'd have a world in which people just save several multiples of their annual spending, and that's just considered normal to hold in cash. And over time, cash and money appreciates, it becomes more and more valuable, it keeps appreciating over time. So everybody has a significant amount of financial security just packed there under their mattress or in their bank account, able to access it at any time, can use it in a business, can use it in case of an emergency. You would see this become much more common. I mean, just imagine what would have happened. We have had an entire century in which the average fiat currency has gone up in supply significantly. Before the 70s, it was relatively much better than it was after the 70s, but still, it's gone up a lot more than just gold. So we've had an enormous amount of devaluation of currencies, which has robbed people of savings, but also discouraged people from saving. So take that out for a whole century and then accumulate the amount of savings that these people would have had. And then imagine what life would be like today. Imagine a world in which everybody, roughly, anybody who's essentially middle class has 5 or 10 years expenditures in savings, in cash, in savings. And then you can invest, and people can choose to invest in that kind of world, but they'd be a lot more deliberate about how they invest. Investing wouldn't be a crapshoot that they feel like they need to get into. It would be a business that they believe they have a significant advantage in, that they're able to contribute with their capital in a way that they have special insight into the industry, or they're working in the industry, so they want to get into it. I use the Wright brothers as the model. That's what it was like under the gold standard. You had 2 bike mechanics who used their extra cash from their bike business to experiment with airplanes in North Carolina and managed to do it, and they flew. And they did it with their savings. So imagine a century in which the whole world just stacks more savings. I think we'd have so much more investment and so much more innovation and so much more creativity and so much more freedom, financial freedom, but also intellectual freedom and engineering freedom as well.
Before we go to the fun stuff, which is comparing our what the effect of a century of gold standard is on the various aspects of life, I'd love to talk a little bit about the political evolution that you describe right after 1915 as well, because this is, again, in my view, highly plausible, and it certainly completely changes the way individuals would be interacting with their governments.
Yeah. So it's going to be tough to summarize all of it here. So I'd urge you, dear listener, to pick up the book to get the details of this, but I'll try and do
I would
it
highly
justice.
recommend that as well.
Yeah, but so World War I, 1915, currencies collapse because all of the rich people and the industrialists are being able to keep their own gold themselves, take self-custody of their gold, and settle with their trading partners. And of course, one major destination for their gold is Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral in the early 20th century. It's been neutral since the early 19th century, I should say. And during World War I, it attracts significant amounts of capital from warring nations. And in this book, it attracts, in the alternative world, it attracts even more capital. So by the collapse of the war, by the end of the war and the end of 1915, the British, German, Russian, French, Italian, and Austrian empires and the Ottomans are all broke, and they can't fight no more, and their trenches are empty. And on the other hand, the Swiss are just swimming in gold because all of the gold is there, and they still have a gold standard. They're still a civilized place where they maintain their contracts, and they are able to redeem your money in gold. So at that point, the Swiss and the Americans had not entered the war. The central bank collapsed, but a lot of people had their money out of the bank, so it wasn't that devastating economically because the central bank was still early at that point. So its collapse was not that devastating. So the U.S. had significant amounts of capital. And essentially, the U.S. and Switzerland called for a conference in Switzerland to try and resolve the war. And the organizers of the conference, Swiss bankers essentially, and the Swiss president, very practical Swiss people who just want to get on with business and life and not have to see their country dragged into a war. Because, ultimately, at that point, Swiss neutrality wasn't guaranteed. Who knows what could have happened? They could have been drawn in.
If any of those countries had been strong enough, they could have taken an aim at them.
They could have. And, they had, within their own population in Switzerland, they had German speakers, they had French speakers, they had Italian speakers. So obviously they had divided sympathies within the country. So it was a precarious balancing act for the Swiss government to pull off at that time. And I use that as the incentive they have for quieting everything down. And since they have all the gold, they are able to set the terms. So, long story short, they come up, all the smartest people in the conference. I bring in Mises, he's at the conference with the Austrian delegation, and all these very smart people. Because you have to understand, all of the banking system collapsed, so all of the imperialists and inflationists in the warring governments have been taken care of one way or the other and are not at the conference negotiating. They have been replaced by their more liberal and pro-gold standard alternatives.
Pacifists.
Yes, and pacifists and people who don't want to get involved in foreign wars. So you have a reshaping of the main and most important actors in the major belligerents, and the conference is a lot more productive. The Mises side and the liberal ideals manage to essentially arrive at a system where the Swiss say, all right, if you want to have our gold, you have to agree to these rules. And these rules involve free trade and free movement of gold. So if you want to have our gold, the gold should be free to come back if it wants to. And the other thing is self-determination. Because that was a big word in the early 20th century. And it was a big problem, which essentially, individual countries and empires would use this as a way to antagonize their rivals. So they would support the self-determination of people under the rival empire to try and undermine the rival empire, but they had no intention of supporting the right of self-determination of the people under them who wanted self-determination. And that was, in a sense, what led to the drama of World War I, which I get into in some excruciating detail in the first part of the book.
It's not excruciating. It's very interesting.
It's very interesting. Well, thanks, yes. I shouldn't knock it. No, I should say it was interesting. It was very interesting. I initially thought I was going to spend, a couple of brief chapters on World War I, but as I started to think about it in a realistic way and to try to see a realistic way of how it could unfold and how it could evolve from it, I had to dig in and I had to get into all these, as you say, wonderful details.
It actually is a really important element because the problem with 1971 as a starting point for reconnecting to gold was that it really was implausible at that point. You could rerun history many times, and it would be rare that you could have actually put the genie back in the bottle at that point and reconnected to gold. It would have been as painful as the British found after World War I. But in the early stage, at your point here, the turning point, we had just been on a hard money standard that was loosening up due to centralization, and it was a plausible alternative, as I think you make a good case for in the book, to depart. So it's good to use this, and it is also, again, we're right in the middle of the political part, which is really phenomenally interesting, this whole idea of opt-out. But keep going, because I interrupted you.
Yeah. So the essential idea of the political order is around self-determination. And the Swiss say any group of people that numbers more than 50,000 can ask for their independence and choose to or join whichever polity that will take them, as long as they organize a referendum with what they set up called a new organization they set up called the International Committee for Self-Determination. And so any group of people anywhere in the world who are agitated about not wanting to be part of their current government can just go around, collect the signatures of 1% of the population, send them to Switzerland, and then Swiss investigators will come to the country, go around, verify a random sample of the signatures, make sure that these signatures are real, and then they will organize a referendum. And if a majority of the people in that geographic area vote in the way that the referendum wants, then all the signatories to the Treaty of Geneva would agree to do what this does. And if you join
recognize that removal of the 50,000 plus people and
Yes.
in either a creation of a new entity or them joining an existing entity.
Exactly. So every member of, or every signatory of the treaty would acknowledge the result of every referendum. And being part of the treaty means being part of a free trade zone and a monetary free zone where gold and money can travel freely. So effectively, that ends up being the winning formula. And the countries that are part of this eventually, the countries that sign it immediately are already the biggest economic bloc in the world, bigger than Britain and its empire, and bigger than France and its empire. So Britain and France stay out, the rest of the world joins in this, but then this is so much prosperity and peace for all of those countries that are in the Treaty of Geneva. They end up instead of spending all of their time in war and destruction, they end up organizing all these referenda. And the countries get cut up, and then they get sewn back together, and parts will leave, and then parts will join again. And it was interminable drama, but it was peaceful. And so it was infinitely preferable to war. And it was prosperous because you were able to trade freely with a big trade region, and you had hard money. And so the economies of these countries boom, and then the rest of the world effectively joins very quickly.
Well, the incentive system that really stuck out to me, the incentive system creates governments that the primary and exclusive motivation is to satisfy the people who you govern to a much greater extent than what has ever been before. It just flips everything out. The opt-out idea is unique in human history, is certainly for large swaths of of human population.
Yeah.
But it's a really interesting technique because it starts, all of a sudden you start realizing, okay, now what is it that a government actually can do for the people? And that's a key factor in certainly limiting the growth of government. Which at the time in the U.S. around World War I, with the exception of the buildup, the U.S. government represented about 3% of the U.S. GDP, and I think Europe had a larger percent in their cost structure, but governments at the time were relatively small.
Yeah, they were under the classical gold standard. They were still limited in what they could do. They built militaries that were in Europe, fighting with each other and wasting an enormous amount of resources. But they didn't have a big bureaucratic state yet, and they didn't have a giant banking and government complex as they do now. So, but of course, the growth of fiat money has been massively bullish for the growth of governments across the world in the 20th century. But that's not the example in this book. In this book, I think of it as thinking of the role of government as a service provider and thinking of the citizen as a customer, and the customer being able to move out. And essentially 50,000 is a relatively small number of people. So they can quite effectively organize to opt out of an arrangement that is terrible for them. And therefore that makes it unsustainable to continue to repress people and milk them financially, because they can move on to somebody better. So of course there's a lot of nuance to how this is implemented. There are a lot more details. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. So I urge readers to dig into it and give me their thoughts. But I think
it's very well fleshed out in the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's a way of thinking about this constructively for the future, because ultimately this is what everybody at least pretended to agree to in the early 20th century, before the two world wars essentially destroyed everybody's sense of perspective and morality and ideas of war and peace. But historically, there was this idea that people had the right to self-determination, that they shouldn't be held by a government that they don't want to be governed by, and that was from where democracy comes. But democracy went the path of voice, where let's get everybody to have a say in how they're governed. And what I suggest here, based on the work of Prince Hans Adam II of Liechtenstein, the current ruling monarch of Liechtenstein, who wrote a great book on this called The State in the Third Millennium, what he suggests is that the best way to serve people is not to give them input into the government process, it's to give them choice in the government providing the process to them. And if you think about it, this is how everything that works in your life has been made. The reason that your phone, your laptop, your microphone, your desk, all of these wonderfully reliable technology that you use every day quite reliably, they managed to make those things for you without you having any input whatsoever into their production. I presume, like most normal people, very few people are being actually interviewed about what goes into laptops and phones, and yet every year you buy the new phone and it's amazing and it does exactly what you want it to do. I mean, not always, obviously, but it's a remarkable process where the goods that you want are constantly improving, and without you having to give input into the process of production. But what you have is the choice to choose between all of these phones. And merely having the choice is what keeps all of these companies doing their best. And the ones that don't do well go out of business. So this process of giving people choice is why we have great phones and great laptops and great cars and desks and everything. Because you don't go and tell the desk makers how to make desks. You look at the finished product and you compare it to the other one and you choose the one that's best. And so they're out there with the real incentive to have to serve you, because ultimately they can't count on your custom. You have to be won over. And so that's what a framework of self-determination would achieve. It would make governments really responsible for people, not because of democratic control, but because of secessionist choice.
And that was the key. It really was a very effective technique to point to the plausibility of this alternative reality. There was another core idea in this book that you've written in many other books as well, and that is resources by themselves are not scarce. The scarcity is how you convert those resources into something useful or valuable or productive. And that is human labor, which becomes the limiting factor, the scarcity. I'd love to talk about that a little bit, because that, to me, explains a lot about why we wouldn't need so much debt, and in this counterfactual of yours, and that human ingenuity would have extracted resources and used energy in a way to increase productivity over time. And energy plays a central role in your book, and I think it's related to this idea of human effort converting resources. And so why don't we talk a little bit about energy and why it played such a major part of the 20th century under the modern gold standard.
Yeah, so in my second book, The Fiat Standard, I look at the evolution of energy production in the 20th century after the move away from gold linking in 1971. And there is significant evidence that there has been a slowdown in the growth of energy. Now, for most people, they think of the 1970s as being an oil crisis. Somehow something stopped working in the chemistry of oil in the 1970s, and that caused a massive economic problem across the world. Of course, that's nonsense. That's just the cover story for inflation. That was the real issue. They unpegged the dollar from gold, and so the money supply increased drastically throughout the 1970s, and the value of the dollar declined, and everything went up in price, and oil was no exception. But a real consequence of this inflation was a reduction in the growth in energy consumption. So energy consumption continued to grow, but it grew at a lower rate, and it slowed down for several years, and it may have even dipped for a few years during the 1970s. And then I think a big part of the problems of energy infrastructure in the late 20th century, I would say, came from inflation, because inflation made fuels more expensive. And fuels are one of the very sensitive things. You know, most people need fuel for their car all the time. So they are pretty sensitive to price on the pump. And so when the price goes up, people are not happy. Or when the bill for the energy they use to heat their house goes up, they're not usually very happy about it. So because of this, governments have been promoting what I call fiat energy or fiat power. In the Fiat Standard, they've been promoting these kind of essentially pre-industrial forms of energy, and it's marketed as if it is better for the planet because, you know, somehow it's going to fix the weather. But ultimately, windmills and solar energy are, in my opinion, pre-industrial, and I think they are a massive waste of resources generally, because these resources could be spent much more effectively on proper hydrocarbon fuel infrastructure or nuclear infrastructure. And I think this has been a symptom of inflation, and I discuss it at depth in the Fiat Standard. But in this book, I work with the hypothesis of what if the growth in energy consumption, industrial energy consumption, which averaged around 4.4%, I think, or 4.1% from 1870 to 1914, if that rate had continued throughout the century, and it is reasonable to expect it to continue, because if you don't have World War I, or World War I ends in a year, and so you save the most advanced capital-owning countries of the world from 4 years of death and destruction, then you are going to naturally have a lot more capital accumulated. If you destroy inflation, there's no more inflation destroying capital. You're going to have a lot more savings. That's going to translate to more capital accumulation. And in the 20th century, what better thing to spend capital on than power infrastructure, you know? So we would have had a lot more growth in power infrastructure in the 20th century if we had continued with hard money, in my opinion. So in this book, I assume that we do. And I continue the 4.1% growth rate and then arrive at a 20th century with a pretty substantial increase in energy consumption. And then I try and imagine what the world would look like if we had 20th century technology advancing at a faster rate. You know, we're getting faster technological advancement because we're not wasting endless trillions of wealth in wars all the time, and we're not wasting the lives of the smartest young people in wars. So all of these people get to live, and therefore they become inventors, and they come up with incredible innovations and so on. So the world's advancing more. And I try and imagine what it would be like if we had continued to advance industrially and in our energy consumption. And I hope I've painted a compelling and thought-provoking picture for the reader.
Yeah, it's an extension of the idea of human labor. I apply an hour of time at creating something, and I take raw materials and I put it together, and I've created something that is of value to somebody. And if I deploy energy in that, now I have a jackhammer instead of a shovel, I'm able to create these things faster. And so that's the connection I see between energy and human time. Those are both limiting factors. And if you can unleash them, you wind up producing much more. Now, a lot of people would be worried about the environmental impact of more energy, particularly you mentioned hydrocarbon, to a lesser extent nuclear, which has turned out to be very safe despite all of our fears. But explain that, because you talk about that in the book as well.
Yeah, also something that I discuss also in the Fiat Standard. I think a lot of the environmental movement comes from essentially inflation. The fear of running out of resources and the fears that overconsumption is going to destroy the planet, I think, are largely irrational result of misunderstanding the basic economic realities of how the world works. And ultimately, I think what promotes these ideas and beliefs is inflation. I don't think it's a coincidence that the 1970s was the decade of environmentalism, in which environmentalism really rose to prominence. Inflation drove people to think that we're running out of resources. Then when inflation slowed down, the prices of resources dropped, the same kind of moralizing hysteria switched from saying we're going to run out of resources to saying that we have so much consumption of resources that consumption is going to suffocate the planet and kill us through various ways. Most prominent, of course, is the idea that a trace gas called CO2 is going to burn the planet somehow, because it's going to rise in concentration from imperceptible tiny number to another slightly larger imperceptible tiny number. But I'm massively skeptical of this, and I discuss it in the Fiat Standard in more detail. So in the gold standard, I don't think that in that world we would have this kind of relationship with resources where people are worried that we're going to run out, or people think of energy consumption as bad, or people think that more infrastructure spent on more infrastructure to produce energy and consume energy is a bad thing. I think people would be throwing holidays, throwing parties and national holidays when their country reaches certain energy milestones, when they're able to arrive at a certain point of energy production. I think in that world we'd see a lot less of this fear, and I think we'd just have abundance and intelligent management of resources and environmental problems.
Let's start going through some of the interesting societal impacts that you lay out. Let's do education.
Yeah.
Because that was really one of the starkest, where you can understand this time preference and how it would apply to the societal function of educating people.
Yeah, I think this one, I kind of came about it inadvertently. At a certain point, I was thinking of just trying to express that in that world there would just be a lot less bullshit work, in the sense of people who show up at an office and produce slop product. You know, they work in terms of rituals. They just perform rituals and get a paycheck. I think this is very common in the fiat economy, because a lot of the fiat economy does not depend on profitably serving customers. It depends on loyally serving governments. Governments have a money printer, so they hire all kinds of people. as essentially loyalty programs. This is common everywhere there's a money printer. And because of this, imagine if we didn't have the money printer in the 20th century. There would be a lot of people who would not be working those jobs. Now, what are those people going to be doing? It was really from that question that I started to think, okay, imagine, roughly most else equal, but we don't have this massive industry of people employed in wasteful make-believe work. And instead, people were working real jobs. And in that world, all of those people are out there. What are they doing? So yeah, obviously there will be more of all the jobs that we have. But I think the one job that would acquire the most people, and I think in this kind of world, it would become a really very ubiquitous job, is education, the job of teacher. And so among the many cliched terminologies that I use for the century, I say some people call it the century of the teacher. Because, the more that you look into education, I think there's an increasing conviction among education professionals that the best intervention that you can do to help students is to offer them a small number of students per educator. So the smaller the class size, the more the learning takes place because the student is able to interact with the teacher. And in a world in which we're growing in abundance in everything, and in a world in which government is not out there hiring people for make-work jobs, I think what would happen is that people would prioritize investing in their children. They would prioritize education for the long term, because people have low time preference. They want to teach their children, and they are willing to spend more and more on their children. And schools have the incentive to serve students in their long-term interest, and they are going to discover that the best way to do that is to hire more and more and more teachers. And so the process of education in the 20th century is this continuous decline in size of classroom, so that by the end of the century, a significant number of people are educated with private educators, so 1-on-1 or 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 or 5-to-1. And as you become richer, your kids have fewer classmates per teacher in each topic that they study. And so I think this is what education would have evolved into in a world of hard money, rather than a world in which the government has the money printer and therefore has, A, the incentive to hire all those people who otherwise would be out there teaching children, because everybody can teach children. It's only a matter of question of what age children can you teach.
And what subject, and yeah, exactly. It's the age and how refined, how specific a category is it that you want to be educating the child. You also talked about the low time preference, and the high savings would allow people to have careers where their leisure time is expanded, and that part of that leisure time would be dedicated to educating young people in the area that you had developed expertise, and that you would have a large voluntary core of educators that would allow for this low ratio of students to teachers. And that struck me as making a lot of sense.
Thanks. I'm glad you liked it. Currently, education is geared toward, as I was saying earlier, they are hiring all those people who otherwise would be teachers, but also they are increasingly, governments are looking at education as being a mechanism for molding the minds of people rather than a mechanism for their long-term interest. And that's why I think we haven't really cared so much about reducing the number of students per classroom, or we haven't made as big strides as we could have during this century, because a big chunk of the focus was how do we brainwash those people into dying for our wars and liking our presidents and using our governmental shitcoin, and that's going to come at the expense of the focus on the quality of the education.
Yeah, as well as the funding coming from governments just carries with it a bureaucratic priority list that is necessarily going to conflict, just by its very nature, with the the core purpose of educating children, which should be for their own benefit, where they are the center.
Yes.
Let's also talk about how is it that people's financial life unfolds. Because you point out that, and then we'll get to housing because it's directly connected, and that is perhaps the most amazing difference. But getting to the housing, really, you got to start with what is it that people are doing with their money, and what happens when you can save an hour of labor in a sound money environment.
Yeah, so as I was saying earlier, in this century we destroyed people's ability to save. But in this book I restore it. So we have a whole century of saving. So people who in the early 20th century used to save in gold, they would have gone through that scare of the Great War, central banking collapse thing. But most people made out of that relatively okay. And some people got a haircut, but then life moved on, and then money and banking was reliable, so people could save. And then money kept appreciating over time, and so the culture of saving blossomed. By the mid-century, basically it was normal for most people to have several years' expenditure saved up. And this becomes sort of a metric that people use to measure their financial health. How much reserves do they have compared to their annual expenditures? And I call it the RE ratio in the book. And your reserves to expenditure. How much reserves do you have? Monetary reserve are you able to hold? And their relation to your expenditure. And most people just end up acquiring many multiples of that in savings because it appreciates over time, and it makes your wealth grow over time. And so because of that, people inherit wealth as well, and because of that, they keep accumulating wealth all throughout their life. So you're born and you get gifts from your family and friends. They give you a gift that is gold, and that gold appreciates so much that by the time you're 25, you want to buy your first home. That gift will have maybe doubled in price or something like that in terms of purchasing power. So over the course of your life, as a child, you start saving the gifts, you start working odd jobs when you're young, you start working as a teenager, and then you start working seriously in your 20s, and you're always accumulating savings, and then by your mid-20s, you would be able to purchase a house because the money is constantly appreciating. And also, the key thing we see is that people aren't using their houses as savings accounts. People buy houses like they buy refrigerators and washing machines. They are durable consumer goods. Yes, you want them to last you a long time, but you do not consider it a part of your financial portfolio, and you do not care about it appreciating so much. And you're not buying it in order to sell it, and there's a lot less demand for houses as a form of saving. So that would mean that houses would decline in price over time. They would continue to become more and more abundant as we produce them, and people would just demand them as goods for their utility as a domicile, as a roof over your head, rather than a financial instrument. So that makes houses cheaper, and it makes them a lot more affordable because people can also save. So the combination of better savings and housing becoming cheaper means that by the end of the century, pretty much everybody can buy their own home in cash with roughly a year and a half's income. Because if you look at data, you see that there's reliable data on this from Britain. We see that the price of housing was declining. The median house, as a percentage of the median wage, was declining throughout human history, essentially. And in the 19th century in Britain, it kept declining. And then at the brink of the war, it was as low as only about 8. So you had to work about 8 years or so to make to buy a home. To buy a home. And of course, 8 years of not spending any money on anything else. There's no reason why that number shouldn't have continued to go down in the 20th century. The reason it didn't go down is, well, there is a reason. That reason is fiat money. And because of fiat money, people can't save, so people have to think of their home as a saving account. So they think of their home as a financial asset. They buy it as a financial asset. They over-allocate to housing, essentially, because it's a better use of money than putting money in under the mattress or putting it into the bank account. So as a result, the price of houses continues to increase throughout the century, on top of not just increasing in terms of the devaluing currency, but also increasing in real terms, in terms of the wage. So we see in the real world, there's like a bottom around World War I of housing affordability. It becomes the most affordable around that point, and then it bounces back and it keeps going up, and it becomes less and less and less affordable throughout the century. But in my history, in my fake century, then it just continues to decline, and it's entirely reasonable. As we become more industrial and more productive, it's entirely reasonable to assume that we would get to a point in the late 20th century where people could buy a home with 1 year's income. Why not?
The world, it's probably worth talking about how the world is completely upside down in when you have a gold standard. I'll start it with this. If we were to move to how could there be a sound money standard today if gold's value is only $22 trillion? That there's so much more capital in the world that how can we reconcile this? And the answer, of course, is that if gold is the standard, then we wouldn't have this enormous amount of capital as a ratio of it. What we would have is declining prices. And so explain a little bit about how this whole idea of inflation and unemployment, and you use interesting examples in the book about when those terms became ever used. But
Yeah.
Let's talk about this upside down world for a minute.
Well, yeah. So the final chapter of the book, or the final few chapters of the book, are where I get back into our real fiat world and discuss the story from the perspective of our real world, to try and offer commentary, essentially discuss the things that I couldn't discuss in that world because they wouldn't exist. One of the main ideas in that end part. And so some of these things that don't exist in the alternative world are the concept of unemployment, and the concept of inflation, and the measurement of CPI. And I look at Google Ngrams, and I find evidence how these things practically never really were mentioned in the 19th century. People really didn't discuss them as phenomena.
Why don't you explain a little bit what an Ngram is for those who don't know?
Yeah, so Google Ngrams is this project by Google which has scanned millions of books, and it's able to, it has systematically collected the data from the content of millions of books, and it has them archived by year. And so you can search for any word, and it will show you the relative frequency in which that word is used across the years. So it's a really interesting tool because it shows you when words get invented and when they come into use. And the word for unemployment and inflation only come into existence right after World War I. And I don't think that is a coincidence. I think it's very telling. And I explain why in detail in this book. I explain why these concepts wouldn't emerge in a world with gold. And in a nutshell, we see that these things are phenomena of inflation. As a result of monetary supply inflation, we get an increase in prices. And we get dislocations in economic production, and that causes the business cycle, which causes continuous waves of unemployment, and that makes unemployment a thing, whereas in the 19th century, that was not a thing. People worked when they wanted to, and not working was not some pathology. You could choose to not be working. But this phenomena of involuntary unemployment, people being unable to find work, is largely a result of the fiat intervention in the market, as I explain in the book. So we don't have that in that century, and we don't have, because also, another aspect of it is that because people have savings, it's quite common for people to just take time off from work. You don't need to be working all the time, because in that world, people would have savings, they wouldn't have debt. So you're not hanging by two paychecks away from being on the street and losing your house and losing your whole life because you need to make the next two paychecks, the next two payments on your mortgage. Everybody's house is paid off. Everybody has significant amounts of savings. And you work because you enjoy work and because you want more money. but it's entirely reasonable to not want to work at a certain point. You want to focus on something else, and you have the savings to do that. So we'd have a world in which the state of work would be a lot healthier. People would be working in places that treat them a lot better because they wouldn't put up with garbage because they're not debt slaves. They can just walk away and spend a year without work without having to worry about it.
Yeah, this is the part that's really, it's really enlightening to think that most of humanity lives in the world like fish. They swim in the water, and you can't tell that it's water. Well, Saif, this has been fantastic. I so appreciate your time, and there's so much more that we could have talked about. But the book I couldn't recommend more highly, and it's great to see you again.
Thank you so much, Bob. Really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you so much for taking the time to do it and for hosting me.
Absolutely. Take care.
Cheers, you too. Take care.